In 1986, you married Phyllis Berman, and eventually, I don't know if you were already a rabbi by then. I don't
No,
think
no,
so.
no.
You both eventually became rabbis.
Right.
So I wonder if you could just talk in our last minutes together here about your partnership and the way in which that the dynamic between you became a dynamo in your own work.
Right. Well, Phyllis came, her pathway into Jewish renewal was, you might say, almost the opposite of mine. She grew up in a lively conservative, capital C, conservative synagogue in Brooklyn. And she said the youth group there was deeply involved in civil rights and learned to daven, and she was really comfortable, except for one thing, which was that women, even in the youth group, women were not real citizens. And she went through a whole process when her own kids became first bar and then bat mitzvah. She said to the rabbi of the conservative synagogue, well, I expect to be on the bima because it's from me. She was in a first marriage. It's from me that the kids are becoming seriously Jewish. And the rabbi said, nothing doing. You can't be on the bima here. And so their bar and bat mitzvah actually happened in a chavurah that she helped create in Teaneck, by that time in Teaneck, New Jersey. And she had met for the first time Zalman when Max Tickton, who had been my teacher in Washington, was still in Madison, Wisconsin, where I had been, but I was totally uninterested at that point, back in the early or mid 50s, right. late 50s, actually. So I didn't go to Hillel, but she was deeply involved Jewishly, so she met and really learned from Max Tickton, who brought Zalman for a Shabbat. And Zalman did stuff that really said to her, I can be a whole person. He used the tune of the melody of Shenandoah in some of the prayers. And she said, I didn't even know exactly what had happened, but suddenly I could be an American, a Jew, a woman, a politically active person. And it was all one me, not chopped up in different places.
Right.
So she was alert then to what Zalman taught later, and she did learn from him later. And so she moved into Jewish renewal, not from the secular place where I had moved toward it, but from the conservative Judaism toward it. And we met in the context of Jewish renewal.
Well, the Chavurah, no?
Yeah, that's right.
First, I met you both at the NHC,
that's
the
right.
National Chavurah Committee.
Right,
Institutes.
That's right. And she had broken through some barriers in her own life when she was 20 years old and a junior at the University of Wisconsin. All her hair fell out. There's a kind of allergy to one's own hair follicles called alopecia, and it totally freaked her out. She thought her life was ruined. She began wearing wigs, and 20 years later, or in the process of toward 20 years later, but it crested 20 years later, she decided the wig was constricting her life far more than just being publicly bald would. And she created a ceremony, totally Jewish renewal thing to do, for taking her wig off. Hanukkah time and her which was her 40th birthday time, but light in the midst of darkness, she took the wig off to cast light on who she really was.
I know, and she's been a proud liberationist for that ever since.
Right.
Yeah.
So we had become friends, but not yet lovers. And she visited Philadelphia and said to me as a friend, I think you really should know what I really look like. And she was still some of the time wearing a wig. She took it off. And I said, my God, you're the most beautiful Martian in the world. So we did connect. She also had gotten to know who I was partly because somebody gave her a Passover present of the Seasons of Our Joy.
Right, which is such a wonderful book that was part of my discovery of your writings.
Yeah.
So, and then you went on since then to write 3 books together, and there's a certain energy in those books of your marriage, of your collaboration.
Right. I think A Time for Every Purpose Under Heaven, which is our book about the Jewish life cycle, I think is a better book than the more famous one, Seasons of Our Joy, which is about the year cycle. And I think the reason it's better is that, it drew, and this was Phyllis's whole way of being, it drew much more on personal experience as well as history, liturgy, etc.
Right.
But much more on personal experience than Seasons did. I think that made it better. And then we wrote together a book of short stories, Midrashic short stories, called Tales of Tikkun, and Jewish Tales to Heal the Wounded World was the subtitle. And we wrote Freedom Journeys, which was Midrash about the Exodus and wilderness stories in the Torah. And they were all informed by the way in which we connected and learned with each other and enriched each other's ways of thinking Jewishly. So that's been a great, aside from sort of at last discovering what it meant to love somebody at last. My brother Howard and Phyllis taught me that late in life. So those have been transformative for me.
That's beautiful. That's beautiful. We are going to end here. We have not talked about the Shalom Center, so it seems like another conversation could be had about that. But we're here in Trump's America, and so I do want to ask you to end with one story that you've told me that I think whoever's watching this should have the benefit of this, which is fast forward a little bit to post 9/11, to the discrimination against Muslims that are going on, and the United Airlines kicking off one of its planes 3 Muslim clerics, and you got a call. What was that about?
So the call goes back a little bit before that, because working through the Shalom Center and actually with Phyllis as the facilitator, we had created a group of Jews, Muslims, and Christians who met once a year for a long weekend, at least a 4-day weekend, that named itself the Tent of Abraham, Hagar, and Sarah, and that was able not only to live together for 4 days and pray together. The official teachings about interfaith stuff were never try to pray together, because it will either be inauthentic or off-putting. But Phyllis figured out how to make prayer possible and authentic for the 3 traditions and communities. And so the first one of those was on the first anniversary of 9/11. And it then continued for 10 years. So I was, and the Shalom Center was, into that kind of work. So some year, I can't remember exactly when, and we would have to look it up to find out, United Airlines threw 3 imams off a plane they were on because they were coming home from a conference of imams in Minnesota, because they threw them off because other passengers were nervous by the simple existence of imams on the plane. And I got a call from another imam in Washington, D.C., who said, listen, we've decided to protest this by doing a pray-in at their offices in the Washington National Airport. Will you come? We want it to be a multi-religious, not Muslim only. And it was Thanksgiving weekend, and I was overwhelmingly busy, and I literally opened my mouth to say, I really dig what you're doing, but I'm just overwhelmed. I can't take the time to do it. And as I open my mouth to say, I can't, there floats into my head a memory which I had not had for decades, which was when I was still a kid, 10 or 11 years old, my grandmother came home from the kosher butcher shop and she looked totally weird. She was sort of teary and also laughing. And I said, Grandma, what happened? She said, well, I was standing in line at the butcher and several of the women in line were talking in Yiddish and they were talking, I listened, and they were talking with contempt about the Schwarzes, that is, the black folk. And I interrupted and I said, you can't talk that way. In Europe, that's the way they talk about us. This is America. You can't talk that way. So this memory comes whoosh out of nowhere. And by the time I opened my mouth, I said, yes, of course, I'll come.
That's a beautiful place for us to transition back to the frame of this conversation. For the last a little more than an hour, I've been talking to Rabbi Arthur Waskow, who founded the Shalom Center, who founded the journal Menorah, who's written 24 books, who several of those with his wife, Rabbi Phyllis Berman, but who's been a light for the fusion of political activism and transformational Judaism, getting back to that revolutionary spirit in Judaism that we know from the Passover Seder. We're going to make sure that this gets with this recording that we'll get into a place where it can be accessed. And it will be there for the ages. We hope that that we live through. We know we're going to live through this dark moment in American history when people are again saying things that should not be said about one another, and we are going to come back to a fundamental principle underlying all religions of hope for transformational change. Thank you very much for your attention, and wish you all the best.